Rubrics, Part 3. You'll remember in Part 2, we talked about the need for building rubrics out of samples. Well, what we want to consider next is the problem of anchoring the rubrics with the right samples. Think about what we said the process is. You have a pile of samples, you read, you sort them into piles, and you have a range of quality. And from that range, we write the descriptors which reflect a summary of each pile, and that's the draft rubric. But wait a minute. Do we have the right samples? Maybe the best student work we've received is only so-so in the wider world. In fact, do a little thought experiment. Maybe we're just a typical school in a typical city. Have we even seen exemplary work done by the best students in the state, in the country? And what would happen to both our rubrics and our scoring of student work if we had those other samples? Here's a rubric. This is another one of those rubrics from the New York Performance Assessment Consortium, this one for mathematical problem solving. You can see the problem in a slightly different way. The rubric doesn't really tell you how good is good enough. It does describe the difference between outstanding, good, competent, and needs improvement, but that's relative to each other. How appropriate or efficient must the solution and approach be? How non-routine and intellectually demanding must the problem be? How soundly does this all have to be accomplished by a student? Now understand, this is not a criticism of this or any other rubric. In general, the rubric begins from the assumption that we can generalize from the samples to derive criteria and indicators that become our descriptors to do performance assessment. But now we have to think seriously, especially in this project, about whether we've anchored the system in the right samples. Or to say it a slightly different way, the rubric answers the question about what criteria and indicators we'll use. But it kind of finesses the question of to what standard. The to what standard question has to do with the rigor, the demands, and those are anchored by either the samples of work or the task difficulty or some combination of the two. Let's look at some examples of these methods in action. This first example is a report card in literacy that's used in the San Diego, California elementary schools. It uses the degrees of reading power, which is an absolute scale, it's not a relative scale, that ranks the degree of difficulty of texts. And you can see here I've identified two of the texts on the scale so you can see what's going on. And you'll see that there are colored bands that reflect where students are. So there's really a sense of where they are versus where they ought to be, perhaps, in terms of absolute difficulty of text. This is a useful example in another way because getting straight on the right difficulty of text is a crucial part of what the new Common Core Language Arts standards are about, in which grade level texts are identified in a way similar to what's going on in this chart. Another way of anchoring the system by the right kind of task is to use a system like Bloom's taxonomy, or what's now widely used around the country, the depth of knowledge scheme, a 4-point rubric for assessing the complexity of the task. Not the difficulty of the task, the complexity of the task. So level 1 is plug-in, level 4 is multi-step, multi-stage, self-assess, self-adjust, project work. And the depth of knowledge scheme is now used in a number of states to help people know the degree of complexity of what local assessment items should be, because the state assessment items are coded, and there's an expectation laid out in the standards about how complex the work needs to be at the local level for students to be prepared for the complexity of the items on the test. So that's one way to do it. We can get clearer on what counts as demanding or rigorous work on some absolute scale. The other way to do it, of course, is by choosing anchor papers or products that represent some valid set, a credible, useful performance standard. Here's an example for an entire district. Greece, New York. Greece is a suburb of Rochester, and for a number of years has done really fine work in essential questions, common rubrics, common prompts, and anchor papers for making scoring across the district consistent in all the genres of writing. And here's a student paper with teacher commentary. Of course, the state has long done this with writing assessments. Here's an example of a Regents anchor, and this material is available from the New York State website. Maybe we want to have an even higher standard, such as the International Baccalaureate. Here is an excerpt from a student paper and judge commentary on why the score was given to this particular paper and why it was a low score. So we have to be able to anchor the system in some credible standard. The standard of the rigor of the task, the standard of the sample of the work against some wider world absolute standard. There is another way to do it with rubrics, and you see it in certain areas, such as in foreign language. But in general, it's been rare in this country to do it, and that is to develop true longitudinal or developmental rubrics, what are now called learning progressions. Here's a fun little example. My children actually had this as a rubric in summer camp for swimming. And you can see it goes from the ranked novice to the pretty good swimmer. And the indicators were so clear and specific that my children were able to self-assess and self-adjust when they weren't in camp based on the rubric. Not a bad goal for rubric designers. Here's the foreign language example that I referred to. For 25 years, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, ACTFL, has had what it calls its proficiency guides. And basically, they are complex developmental rubrics that go from novice to advanced with a number of points in between. And here are a few examples along the scale. You can see it's very specific and enables the scorer, regardless of the student's age and experience, to place the student on a continuum. These rubrics are used by the state of New Jersey as part of its approach to world language and student assessment in the schools. Well, even if we don't have developmental rubrics, we can still do a kind of modified approach. Here's an interesting example, and a number of schools that we've worked with have done something like this. What if we wanted a writing assessment for grades 6, 7, and 8, all middle school? Well, instead of just having a 6th grade assessment, a 7th grade assessment, and an 8th grade assessment, why not build the 8th grade assessment and have all students from all 3 grades participate in the writing assessment? And we score their work against exit level 8th grade standards, which have been deliberately set to be high and linked to wider world good high school standards. Now, not only do you get clarity about performance against a worthy goal, but you have 3 opportunities to know how you're doing against 8th grade exit standards. So that is a nice little system that could be put in place right away and over time lead to more sophisticated longitudinal studies. This is clearly the direction that we're headed, as this comment from the Common Core Math Standards introductory material reminds us. One other point to mention about absolute performance levels: it's not enough, we think, to just identify the absolute scale, to identify worthy tasks, to build the rubrics accordingly. There's an implicit challenge that goes along with this. We have to make sure that the student is performing independently or autonomously. We have to make sure that we have a good read on the student's level at independent performance. And so we have found it helpful to recommend to people the following rubric: a rubric for the degree of autonomy of the student work in question. And this is a special rubric that you could use with any performance assessment. It would also encourage the teachers/judges to take note of whether their interventions are appropriate, and if they make interventions, to acknowledge it in the ultimate scoring. Here's an additional rubric that you can use to signal to students that we don't want you to just go off independently and flounder. Failing independently is not our goal. That we want to acknowledge that there are also situations in which asking for help is a measure of autonomy. And so you can see that we now have a fairly sophisticated system. If we can judge your work not just against a rubric, but a rubric supported by credible wider world standards, supported by rubrics that get at how autonomous your performance level really is.